It's been a little while since we've done a tier list for TEPPEN, so let's fix that. But first, let's clarify how it's going to work. I'm going to rank several decks in 4 tiers, tier 1 through 4, 1 being the best of the best and 4 being the worst. I'll provide lists for every deck above tier 4, otherwise it would just take entirely too long. This list applies to the Wesker season only. And finally, and I cannot stress this enough, this is just my opinion. This list is based on my experiences playing through Champion every single season since the game's release, but I am not proclaiming my opinions as fact. Feel free to disagree. In fact, let me know in the comments what you think. And with all of that out of the way, let's get started. Tier 4 is pretty dull. This is where I'm putting decks that are having no impact on the meta right now. If you see your favorite hero art on this list, I'm sorry, but these decks just aren't consistent enough to make an impact in high level play. That doesn't mean that you can't have fun with them. It just means that they lag behind other options. It is important to note that only one character has all of their hero arts listed here, and that's Rathalos. A few more noteworthy mentions are Quicksilver Dante and Devilbreaker Nero. Tier 3 is much smaller. These are the decks that can work well in very specific situations, but lack the ability to win consistently against the better decks of the season. Let's begin with Hey Nico for Nero. This deck will look very similar to the mono green Yawn builds I'm sure you're familiar with. Hey Nico explores one of 3 potential cards when used. 2 of them are very good. That's Gabrera and Ragtime. The third, Tomboy, is pretty underwhelming, and that inconsistency is what really hurts this deck compared to 2 others we'll see later on this list. Next is Ashura Senku Akuma, specifically the very aggressive purple and black deck I showed you a couple of weeks ago. There is a mono black version, but I don't think it's quite as effective. This deck is all about putting your opponent down with aggressive flying units quickly. Ashura Senku can protect them to get final bursts of damage, but with the prevalence of easy to trigger destructive effects and Hoitzel's anti-air, this isn't easy to pull off. This deck could become a bit better depending on how the balance changes in March go. Big Resonate is next, both the Devil Trigger Dante version and the Temptation Morrigan. The goal is to use Resonate units that get bigger as you stop your opponent from reacting to them with negates and halts. Purple players will probably disagree with me on this one, but this deck already dropped in popularity from the Force Seekers in January. Plus there are more nerfs coming that target several cards these decks use. It's just not as consistent as it used to be, and that reflects in the deck's popularity. Rounding out tier 3 is Heart Tank X. I really wanted to put this deck in tier 2 because there are several talented players doing their best to grind with X, but this deck is just a weaker version of Yawn at the end of the day. Your goal is to utilize all of those juicy new green units from the new expansion. Heart Tank helps keep them alive. The issue here is you won't have as much MP as Yawn to throw your weight around. Without it, the MP curve for this deck can seem somewhat high, even with MP boosting units. I want to add that even though X is at the top of tier 3, he's in a much better position than he ever has been in TEPPEN. Now we're in tier 2, where things begin to get much more consistent. These decks can certainly climb the ranked ladder, but have more unfavorable matchups than the few decks in tier 1. Antibody Activation Jill fits nicely here. I'm by no means a Jill expert, but I've got several friends who are. They all agree that Jill is a mid-tier deck because she didn't get many useful additions from the Force Seekers. Now that being said, Antibody Activation is a really strong hero art, and this deck can do well if piloted correctly, but that's not easy. Several top players including Ryuzu and Yo-Yo-Lon, 2 US competitors who competed at the World Finals in December, they both say Jill is the most difficult deck to pilot in the game. She struggles against green's high health units, black's cheap destruction, and units with damage reduction like Oro. Next is something a lot of players have been sleeping on, myself included. That's Spike Dive Bomb Nergigante. This uses much of the purple and black shell that makes aggressive flying decks so popular. The real advantage here over something like Quicksilver or Ashura Senku is the hero art itself. It's 15 AP to give 1 unit +4/+4, but that unit destroys itself after making its next attack. This is great for keeping a low health flyer alive for 1 final burst of damage. This deck suffers from several low health units which Ryu just loves to pop, plus green decks also come with Hoitzel and Seal, which can shut down your damage dealers. Speaking of Ryu, his Shinku Hadoken build fits nicely in Tier 2, one of the easiest decks to pick up, but precise timing on trades can really get you far with this deck. A lot of top players stick to Ryu for this reason. Ascension as a mechanic is also great for Ryu. It prevents him from becoming board locked since his deck is so heavy on units. Now where he struggles is against high health units, which green has so much of, but he also shuts down offense really well. You're happy to see these purple and black decks as a Ryu player. However, black and green dual color decks will be a little bit harder for him. Next is Raging Demon Akuma. I wanted to put this deck a little higher because black got so many fantastic cards from the new expansion. Alexia Ashford, Junie, Betrayal, Fate of the Unworthy, they are all in this deck. Cheap destruction means your opponent struggles to build momentum. This is a control deck that can work very well, but the hero art itself isn't as consistent as another entry on this list. It's also more expensive. Last in Tier 2 is Ouroboros Wesker. This is probably a surprise to some of you because of how explosive the deck can be. This deck utilizes big, powerful units like Gormagala and the Tyrants to swing hard on your opponent. This deck also has a lot of life gain, making it an ideal choice if you want to play into the late game. But as nice as that sounds, this also plays into the deck's primary weakness. Certain aggressive decks can outpace Ouroboros and get a heavy lead before your resources are built up. It also struggles against Yawn and purple decks that can keep those big units at bay sometimes. Now we're in Tier 1, the best decks that TEPPEN has to offer right now. We'll begin with what I would consider a controversial pick, and that is Spike Launch Nergigante. I'm specifically talking about the mono black version of the deck, not the green and black variant. That version just isn't nearly as effective in the current state of the meta. The reason this deck shines is the same reason as many other black element decks on this list. Lots of removal, ways to regain your health from sacrificing for cards, and then you build your health pool back up. This deck's biggest weakness is getting too low on health to recover, so make sure you're monitoring that number throughout the match. The third best deck right now goes to Dark Destruction Wesker. The hero art targets so many units in the meta right now, and all of those new black cards I mentioned earlier work to great effect here. Your goal is to set the pace of the match and make optimal trades to keep your opponent behind. Another great addition is the Core Tyrant, which deals with weaker flyers and MP boosting units very well. However, decks that play a lot of expensive units outside the range of most of Wesker's removal can be tough to handle. Number 2 on this tier list is Shadowblade Morrigan, but it's a variant you won't see much of unless you're pretty high ranked in Champion. I'm not talking about the more common builds that look like this. The deck I'm considering for this list utilizes Rose, a new epic unit from the Force Seekers that explores an action when she resonates. This alone makes Surge of Demonic Power much more consistent, providing powerful action cards at a discounted price. This deck has a lot of great matchups, that's why so many top players stick with it. Its only real challenges are the other tier 1 decks this season. Come on, did you really think I'd put any other deck at number 1? Chun-li is incredibly dominant right now. The sheer value you get from cycling Ascension units means you'll always have the resources to keep your board full. Rainy Turtloid, Hoitzel, Rikuo, Call to Battle, and Gold Orb, all new cards, and they all work incredibly well with Yawn's engine. Black decks can combat what she does by removing MP batteries early, making it tough to build up all 3 lanes, but this deck has an answer in Natural Cycle, which really destroys black decks that are focused on revenge. Purple decks can also try to halt their progress and win quickly, but it isn't guaranteed. I am very confident that Yawn is the best deck in Teppen's meta at this point. That's my tier list for the Wesker season of TEPPEN. Let me know what you think in the comments, especially if you disagree. Deep discussion on TEPPEN is what I live for, so be sure to let me know what you think in the comments. And if this is the kind of content you enjoy and you want to see it keep coming, be sure to give this video a like and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you so much for your time and all of your support. Take care, and I'll see you next time.